Abba Eban, ambassador and statesman, the first representative from Israel to the United Nations, ambassador to the United States, and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, died on Sunday, November 17, 2002.
Yes, well, here they are on marriage day, my late father and my mother. My parents hailed from South Africa. They made the journey, terrifying journey, around the Cape of Good Hope and avoiding the German U-boats on the way. This was the First World War, and I therefore arrived at the age of 1 year in London. This is a picture of my grandfather, who had a very strong influence on me. He used to almost kidnap me on weekends and plunge me into Hebrew ideas and Hebrew speech and Hebrew language, to such an extent that I really became bilingual at the age of 5 or 6. Oh yes, this is with my sister and brother.
At the age of 19, Abba Eban entered Cambridge University.
I undertook a course of study which was based upon Hebrew and Arabic and later Persian literature. It seemed to me that a capacity to move audiences to agreement and emotion was a talent superior to the talent of being able to write some kind of medieval treatise upon the history of the Caliphate or other parts of Arabic literature.
I first met Abba Eban in Cambridge, 38, 39, that curious twilight year between Munich and the war. And if anyone wonders where the polish and the wit and the style, which he showed in later years, where he developed that, it was at the Cambridge Union.
While at Cambridge, I was a very pronounced Zionist, and so much so that the Zionist headquarters, including the great Chaim Weizmann himself, were in touch with me. Working for Weizmann made me achieve contact with people at a far higher level than my rather modest rank would justify. The work that I did in enlisting Zionism led me to some rather paradoxical situations. For example, the son of Chaim Weizmann, Michael Weizmann, was a student there. He was almost the only person who refused to yield to my blandishments for joining the Zionist Society. This is Queen's College, Cambridge, which was the college where I studied for my first 4 years.
Eban so excelled at university, he earned the almost unheard of triple first, gaining first-class honors in 3 subjects. When Hitler began to overrun Europe, Eban enlisted as an officer in the British Army.
Many things in Jewish history are too terrible to be believed, but nothing of that history is too terrible to have actually occurred. The consciousness of what was happening in Europe aroused in me 2 feelings. One was a sense of the deep horror of what was happening, the almost unbelievable outrage and atrocities to which the Jewish people was being submitted, but also a sense of solidarity, a feeling that my devotion from this time onward must flow principally into the Jewish context and not into any other.
It was during that time Eban met Susie Ambacha, an Egyptian Jew. They would soon marry and spend the next 58 years together.
I first met my husband after he sent a note to my father in 1942 it was. He came to call. I didn't pay much attention to him because he looked such a serious gentleman. I was rather young and I thought life should be full of fun.
I had pursued my attentions on Susie for some time. For example, I must have paid more visits from Jerusalem to Cairo than anybody else. I remember the Consul General of Egypt in Jerusalem became rather suspicious of the frequency with which I was making that journey.
When the war ended, Eban astounded his friends by choosing a very uncertain future.
I was turning down what was a very probable career in British politics and what was a certain career in the tranquility of Cambridge and in a possible career in the British Foreign Service. I was turning down all of this. Why? Because the stirrings that were happening in the Jewish world were, for me, as it were, they were almost equivalent to an order to give preference to the Jewish context. It was not a prosaic choice, it was a poetic decision. And many people around me thought it was a rather crazy decision to take.
By 1946, Eban was at the center of the drive to create Israel. Then, for some 40 years, he was one of the most visible and passionate representatives of Israel's national destiny.
His rhetorical skill was awesome. He had a facility to string words together and have them be meaningful without a pause, without groping for a word, without a text. That was absolutely unique, I would say, in my experience.
Amidst the echoes of brutal war and siege, at a time when Jerusalem called aloud in its agony, and when Iraqi forces, astride of the water supply of the city, were condemning it to death by pestilence and thirst.
What I remember is in '69, when he was Minister of Foreign Affairs and I was security advisor, and he came into my office and said, remember, we Israelis consider objectivity to be 100% agreement with our point of view. And I thought he was kidding, and I learned painfully later that he was serious.
Abba Eban was a very effective diplomat, partly because of his clarity of mind, partly because of his sense of the structure of a situation, and partly because people believed him, and partly because he had a long view of things. He was steeped in history, and that gave him a certain immunity to panic and crisis.
One of the embarrassing functions of a diplomat is to know what to do when he receives impossible instructions from his own government. Let me give you a very personally wounding example. Before the outbreak of the Six-Day War in 1967, I was working actively in Washington to see if we could get some assurance of assistance from the world community. I suddenly received a telegram from Jerusalem saying, would I please achieve the following result, to get the United States to say that an attack on Israel is an attack on the United States. Well, the only trouble with that was that it was absolutely impossible to achieve.
Israel was a very small country at the time and not all that well known. And I think he put it on the map as a universal phenomenon. And he managed to embed Israeli concerns into something that people outside the Middle East could understand. I think that was a very major contribution.
I shall invite every peace-loving state represented here to ask itself how it would have acted on that day if it faced similar dangers. It is beyond all honest doubt. It is beyond all honest doubt that between the 14th of May and June the 5th, Arab governments, led and directed by President Nasser, methodically prepared and mounted an aggressive assault designed to bring about Israel's immediate and total destruction.
You have to end up by compromise between what justice demands and what circumstances permit. And I suffered very much because so many of my fellow countrymen believed that I was being much too pliant and much too flexible in what I was asking for.
He was an effective envoy because his style and his humor and his personally engaging qualities were something which the Americans appreciated. But the kind of phrase which one associates with Eban, like the one about the Palestinians who never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, or when he says, we now see tunnel at the end of the light.
He was a very good foreign minister, and he, even when not a foreign minister, he's been an extraordinary emissary for Israel. In terms of ability, he might have been prime minister, but he was never accepted within the Israeli body politic as a universal Israeli.
Through decades of conflict and multiple wars, Abba Eban used his formidable powers of eloquence and persuasion as his weapon to defend and protect Israel.
principles of...
He never lost his faith that peace could be achieved in his homeland.
How come that this very small people, now only about 13 or 14 million people, has been gifted with a voice that has reverberated and resonated across all these centuries? And then the mystery of suffering. Why did this people become the target for such an ordeal of suffering? And then the mystery of what I call renewal. When did it happen that a small people put its remnants together across the whole world and then re-established its life in the same tongue, in the same faith, in the same language, and on the same territory that it inhabited thousands of years ago? In other words, I end up with the feeling that there's much more mystery than logic in history.
We now present Episode 1, Israel, A Nation is Born.